everyone, and welcome to KCS At Home Summer Edition. This is Activity 4. I'm Ashley Fleming, and I'm a fourth grade teacher at West Hills Elementary School, and I'm so excited that you've decided to join me today to read, talk, and do some preparing to write about a great text. If you need any of the handouts for today's lesson, head on over to the student resource page. Now, before we get started today, here are some helpful hints you can use in case the video is hard to understand at any point in time. Keep in mind that this may only work for those of you watching on a computer or similar device. If you're watching on television, KCS TV, or PBS, you may not be able to do some of these. One option is to turn on the closed captions. You can adjust the speed and slow down the video. You can watch the video in clips by pausing the video or re-watching certain parts again. Lastly, you can ask someone in your home to watch the video with you. You can stop the video and ask questions or talk to your partner if anything seems hard to understand. Throughout these activities, we've discussed and built on the concept of adventures by land, air, and water. Our essential question has been, what makes an adventure? Now, we've learned that there are different word parts to adventure. For example, ad, which means toward, or vent, which means come. And lastly, that suffix T-U-R-E, which means the action of. When we put all these together, we better understand that an adventure is the action of coming towards something. We've even discussed the actual definition of an adventure, and that it can be an unusual and exciting, typically hazardous experience or activity. It can be engaging in the exploration of an unknown territory. Take a look at this picture here. Do you see any images that might ensue an adventure? In activities 1 and 2, we mentioned all kinds of stories that we read this year in fourth grade that might have had adventure. Which one did you enjoy the most? Maybe it was Lewis and Clark and Me, Navajo Code Talkers, or even Seeker of Knowledge. But in these past 3 summer activities, we've dug into stories of true adventure. For example, with Are You Prepared for an Emergency?, where Ms. Snyder read and discussed with you how to best prepare for hazardous weather at your home. What were some of the items you should have in your emergency kit? Did you make an emergency plan with your family? Remember, being prepared helps you to remain calm in emergencies. Maybe you remember in activity 2, when we discussed another adventure on land in An Amazing Discovery. Aldo and his family uncovered some awesome artifacts in the 1700s that told of a hidden city destroyed by a volcanic eruption. Their small discovery told of the hazardous adventures faced by the people of the ancient cities of Herculaneum and Pompeii. It also told of the scientists and the tourists who came to see and learn more from these unearthed artifacts. Lastly, in activity 3, you got to learn more about adventures by water with a man of persistence. This passage told of an adventure with explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton and his crew of the Endurance. Their mission was to be the first people to cross the Antarctic continent by foot. Did you consider their mission a success or failure? Well, today we're going to take our story of adventures out of this world by air. Now, before we get into our text, let's talk about some words that we're going to encounter that we might want a little background knowledge on before reading them in the text. One strategy that we know helps us to better understand unfamiliar words is to identify any roots that they may have and their meanings. Oftentimes, we come across Greek and Latin roots, and once we familiarize ourselves with some of their meanings, we can apply them to other words with those same roots. The first word I want to show you today is the word astronaut. Now, many of you might know and have some background knowledge on this word, but knowing the meaning of some of its roots might help us in the future. The first root we see is astro, which means star. It's a Greek root. The next Greek root is naut, which is here at the end, and it means sailor. So the word astronaut literally means sailor of the stars. Sounds about right and fits right in knowing that today we're reading about adventures by air. Now the next word I want to show you is this word aeronautics. Now we can break this word into its Greek roots as well. We have aero, which means air or lower atmosphere. Here's not again, which means sailor. And then we have the suffix IC, which means the characteristic of. So putting that together, we have the ability or characteristics of sailing around in the air or lower atmosphere. What things do you think of when you hear the word aeronautic? Maybe you thought of a plane. Next, we're going to see the word terrain being discussed in our text. This word terrain contains the root ter, which means earth or land. So when we see the terrain being described, we know that it's talking about the ground that is being traveled on. Lastly, I want to discuss the word lunar. Now, this word derives from a French word, and it means pertaining to the moon. You may have discussed it in science or heard of the lunar eclipse or even a lunar surface. Now, while I was thinking of all these words in our topic in today's text, I wondered if we had read any texts this year in 4th grade that might relate to some of them. Do you remember reading about this astronaut? You may remember reading that she became the first Hispanic woman to go to space when she served on a 9-day mission aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery. That sounds like an adventure. Her name was Ellen Ochoa, and people even referred to her as a space pioneer because of what she accomplished. Now make sure today to keep an eye out for these roots in your text. We'll use our background knowledge now to help us better understand what we read. Let's take a look at today's learning target and success criteria. Today, we're going to be reading closely to explain how lunar vehicles have evolved and why. We're going to know that we're successful when we have done these things: described the lunar vehicles and explained how and why they evolved. Now, when we identify those key details in the text that describe how lunar vehicles have evolved or changed over time, we're showing our understanding of the topic. We can look back and reread the text if we need to as well. This helps us to better understand the information in the text, and it makes us stronger, more fluent readers. We also want to make sure to include some specific content vocabulary. We can discuss this after reading, just to show our understanding of the topic in our writing. And lastly, we want to think of the conventions of our writing. We want to think about including a variety of sentences with correct punctuation and capitalization. These also can be improved upon when we reread our written response or ask someone else to look over our work. After we read and discuss the text, we'll come back to our learning target and success criteria. So let's take a look at our text for today. Today, our passage is called Lunar Vehicles. What do you think a lunar vehicle could be based on what we've discussed in your prior knowledge? You may have said something like a vehicle that travels on the moon, because you might know that a vehicle is something that gets you from one place to another, like a car or a bus. And we learned that the lunar is having to do with the moon. Now we can also use the surrounding pictures as clues too. What do you notice? How does the terrain look different from what we have here on Earth? I'm sure many of you noticed this person or astronaut here in his spacesuit. Not typical of our outfits here we wear on Earth. I noticed the gray ground and the dark skies in the background. I don't see any grass or water anywhere in sight. What do you think this is here? What things do you notice about it? I noticed that it has wheels and maybe some kind of satellite. I noticed that it doesn't look like it has doors like a car. And these observations can help me when I read the passage closely here in a minute. They also might help me when I'm doing my descriptions in my quick write today about how the lunar vehicles have changed or evolved. As we dig deep in our passage today, keep in mind these things and what we've discussed, the words and what we've learned. And of course, let's keep in mind our learning target to explain how lunar vehicles have evolved and why. Let's go ahead and get started here with the first paragraph. Remember to have a pencil or highlighter handy to annotate with me as we read. Let's read aloud together. How would you travel across Earth if there were no roads, railways, or bridges? You could go on foot, but there would be challenges, especially when trying to cross rough or mountainous terrains. Astronauts on the moon face this problem. There are no public transportation or highway systems on the moon. More importantly, the surface of the moon is rocky and full of craters, some deeper than others. Now, let's start here with the question the author poses to his audience. How would we travel without the roads, railways, or bridges we have now? What do we use these things for? What do they cross over? Maybe water or other land? The author mentions we would have to go by foot. But this would cause some challenges. Now, what challenges might we face traveling by foot across the Earth's surface? Good. There's rough, sometimes even mountainous terrain. Now, here's that word we discussed, terrain. Remember, we mentioned that ter was referring to what? Good, the earth or land. Now, I think the author is trying to make a connection here for us. But he's talking about some different travelers, not us. Who's he talking about? Right, astronauts, those sailors of the stars. It seems like he's trying to get us to think about what the terrain is here on Earth so we can make a connection to where? Good, the moon. Now, it describes the moon's not terrain, but he calls it the surface. And how does he describe it? Good, rocky and full of craters. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the word crater. The author does give a bit more by saying that some are deeper than others. Since we know he's talking about the surface, which is usually flat, deeper must be describing the way the surface dips down. Craters are large, bowl-shaped cavities in the ground or surface of the moon, usually caused by an explosion or the impact of a meteorite or other celestial body. Many things crash into the moon and leave these holes in the surface, making it difficult to travel across. Now that the author has described the surface of the moon as being somewhat difficult to travel across by foot, and we know we're reading a passage called Lunar Vehicles, we can begin to see the connections to why the lunar vehicles are needed. Now let's continue and keep reading, and keep in mind that a piece of our success criteria will be to describe the lunar vehicles themselves. Take a look at what NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, developed to help travel the rough terrain of the moon. As you read, notice the different features of what they developed. Go ahead and take a minute to read this next paragraph. Now remember, if you didn't quite finish, you can pause the video if possible. Now let's start with, when was this vehicle developed? Yes, the early 1970s. And by who again? Right, NASA. What was it that the astronauts were sent on? Good, they called them missions. Do you think a mission is like an adventure? Do you think these astronauts are facing hazardous or unusual experiences? What was the purpose of the missions these astronauts were sent on? Right, to explore the surface of the moon. How were they going to explore? Yes, they needed the lunar roving vehicle, the LRV for short. As we continued reading, we saw several descriptions or features of this vehicle. Now, glance back at the paragraph and see if you can identify a few of these text details. I'll give you a second. You may have seen four-wheeled, open air, buggy, which is a small carriage for carrying heavy goods. You might have seen battery-powered, two passengers. I also see that it can withstand the extreme environment. It had a video camera and even an antenna. Now that we see some of these features on the LRV, I want to take a second look at the paragraph and I want to identify some of the reasons why they have some of these features. For example, why does the LRV need to withstand extreme environments? Yes, it mentions in the text that the temperatures on the moon can get very hot or very cold in a matter of seconds. Do you know why this happens? I decided to do a little extra research on why this happens because I found it so interesting. I actually watched a video on PBS Learning that I got from the student resource page. It describes the moon as having no atmosphere, and because of that, the temperatures are extreme and kind of dangerous. So I'll add this link in the topics to our extension work. Now, what about why do they need a video camera and antenna? Right. It says that it enables the astronauts to send pictures and sounds. Where are they sending them to? Right, from the moon back to Earth. Now let's go ahead and take a look at this next paragraph together. We're going to find out some more about the purpose of the LRV. Now, as you read, I want you to go ahead and stop at on foot, which will really be on your next page. But I've added it to the slide just in case. Go ahead and take a second to read this next paragraph. Now, in this next bit, the author uses a new word to describe the missions that the LRV was used for. Do you see it? Right. He called them excursions. He even used the word trips in the next sentence. Now, what did the LRVs allow the astronauts to do? Right. We read before that their purpose was to explore the moon, but we also see that the LRV allowed the astronauts to travel farther and longer than by foot. Now let's continue this paragraph on the next page and learn what else the LRV could do. Go ahead and take a second to finish that paragraph at the top of the next page. What was the next thing that was useful about the LRV? Good. It can climb steep, rocky slopes and move easily over the moon's surface. Remember how we discussed how difficult it could be to travel the rough terrain of the moon. Now, all of this is made easier for the astronauts using the LRV. Next, let's think about the fact that astronauts might find items while they're exploring the moon's surface. How is the LRV useful when it comes to this? Right, it can carry more than twice its weight, which is helpful in carrying its equipment and the collection of rocks that they get. Now, one final thing the author mentions is kind of a negative about the LRV. Did you see it? What was it? Good. The LRV was not designed to be used for a long time. In fact, it could only be used for one mission. Boy, that got me to wondering, why was that? Did they not know enough yet about moon travel? Maybe they didn't know how to get it back home. Hmm. Now, so far, we've read about one of the lunar vehicles. We have read about its great features and how purposeful it was for astronauts in their moon exploration. Remember that our learning target was to explain how lunar vehicles evolved and why. So let's finish up these last two paragraphs and see if we can collect any text details that might add to our understanding of the vehicle's evolution or change over time. Go ahead and take a minute or two to finish reading the passage. Remember, if you need an extra minute, go ahead and pause the video. But let's dig into that paragraph. The author uses the phrase as the turn of the century. So that's around the year 2000. So about 30 years later, we begin seeing some developments in lunar vehicles. Now, what does it say happened? Right. NASA began developing models for a modern vehicle. Let's look closely at some of those changes and developments that were made. First, we see that the name was changed to Lunar Electric Rover. The author is using keywords and phrases in this paragraph to show us some similarities and differences between this vehicle and the LRV. It also says that this was one of the models, which tells me there could have been others, but the author decided to focus on this particular one. What were some of the features of the Lunar Electric Rover? One thing I noticed first is that it is pressurized and it has 12 wheels. Now, I wonder why this model has 12 wheels instead of just the 4 like the other model. Next, we see that this vehicle can be used longer. How long? Yeah, for 10 years, not just one mission like before. Next, we see that it can only hold 2 astronauts. Now, that is something that was similar. However, something has improved for the travel of these 2 astronauts. What were some added features? Good. The astronauts can now sleep and use sanitary facilities. Can you guess what that is? Yep, it's a bathroom. Well, that's going to come in handy because now they can travel a long time on these missions. How much longer can they travel on this new model? Right. They should be able to travel for thousands of miles, lasting even up to 14 days. Think of all the collections that can be made on these longer excursions. Now, in the last paragraph, we read that the technology needed to put this vehicle on the moon was not quite ready. But in this year, the year of 2020, NASA planned to send astronauts back to the moon, possibly using this lunar electric rover. What a great topic to research further and find out if NASA is still on track for this, or did they still need some developing? All right. Let's go back to our learning target. Remember, we were reading closely today to explain how lunar vehicles have evolved and changed. Did you hear some of those changes in the lunar vehicles? What about why they might have needed those changes? Good. Let's use that today to answer our quick write. Write a paragraph to explain how lunar vehicles have evolved and why. Use evidence from the text to support your response. Now, we also need to revisit our success criteria so that we'll know if we've met our learning target and have included everything we need in our response. Now, Remember, when thinking about what to include in our response, we should consider describing the lunar vehicles. There were several descriptions used in the text that we underlined. Jotting these down in your notes before writing might help you to organize them and then use them in your descriptions. Next, we need to explain how the vehicles evolved or changed and compare the descriptions of the two vehicles from the text. Revisit the text and add to your notes the text details that we read and discussed. Look back at some of those words and phrases that the author used to compare the vehicles, like additionally, like, or unlike, and try to use them in your own writing. Remember that we also want to include some specific vocabulary which can show our understanding of the topic. What words do you think we might need to include in our writing? Sure, maybe astronauts, lunar, missions, explorations, excursions, maybe even vehicles, I would hope. There are plenty of words to show your understanding of this topic now. Lastly, when we think of the conventions of our writing, let's remember to think about including a variety of sentences with correct punctuation and capitalization. Remember, this is a great time to talk to someone else at your house and have them read over your written response. Even taking the time to read over your own work helps you to correct and improve your writing. If you'd like to see an example of a quick write response after you complete yours, feel free to visit the KCS at Home resource page. Now, let's take a look at some extension activities you might consider. You could make a list of questions you still have about the Lunar Electric Rover. Try doing a little extra research to learn if NASA is on track to send this vehicle to the moon in 2020. Was there more technology needed? If you visit the student resource page on KCS at Home, there's a link to PBS Learning Media. This is the page where I found the video I watched. You can watch more great videos about the moon and all of its surroundings. So see what new information you can find, or possibly even answer those questions that you had. Lastly, you can Google NASA Space Place, and you'll find this website for NASA that offers kids all kinds of videos and activities. I think you'll really enjoy it. Let's take a recap of what we learned and discussed today. We've extended our knowledge on what makes an adventure. Our passage today told of missions taken by astronauts. It also told about some of these vehicles and excursions on the moon that they used. Our learning target was to read closely to explain how lunar vehicles evolved and why. We discussed the different descriptions of the lunar vehicles from the 70s and the improvements that were made by NASA since then. We even read about why the improvements were made. We discussed a writing task that you can complete to show your understanding of the passage. Again, if you wish to see another example on the quick write, you might complete yours first and then head over to the KCS resource page. We also mentioned some extension activities on the previous slide that you can complete to learn more or even extend your thinking on the moon and its explorations. Thanks again, guys, for joining me today at KCS at Home Summer Edition. And I really hope you enjoyed our passage today. I'm Ashley Fleming, and I am so glad to have spent this time with you and learn more about some lunar vehicles. Hope you have a great afternoon, guys.